Well, hello there everyone! Etrian Odyssey is one of my favorite game series to come out of the handheld side of Nintendo consoles. The interesting level design, labyrinth events, tough battles, excellent music, and customization makes for a very fun experience I can recommend people at least try. I, however, do not apply this statement to the original Etrian Odyssey. This game is clunky, has some broken mechanics, very little in ways of character, still some really good music, and level design that is either pretty good or downright sadistic. I'm honestly surprised this series ended up getting a sequel, but I'll never say under any circumstances to play the original Etrian Odyssey. If you must play it, either play the HD Remaster, which adds some nice quality of life improvements and visual touch-ups, or if you can, consider playing the 3DS remake, Etrian Odyssey Untold: The Millennium Girl. That is a far superior way to experience this game. But we're not here to talk about any of those today. We're here to rank the boss fights from worst to best, and I'll be playing through the HD Remaster. Originally, this was actually going to make for a video covering the game as a whole, but honestly, it just wasn't turning out as well as I was hoping, and it just didn't feel right, so I decided to scrap the project, but hey, I've still got the footage, so time for a bit of reduce, reuse, recycling. Also, I've got an Etrian Odyssey 5 boss ranking video in the works, so I figured, hey, why not get this one out? The game has a fair number of boss fights, but I will be lumping some of them together because they're basically the same fights. Etrian Odyssey 1 is a game I do enjoy, but I think the enjoyment takes a swan dive off the cliff once you reach the post-game, and I'm not even going to bother counting the dragon clones. They are just a waste of time. But that's enough rambling. Let's get into this ranking, shall we? Number 13. The Primeval. The ultimate super boss at the end of Etrian Odyssey. This Lovecraftian horror, and he sucks. I hate this fight. It is the textbook definition of a bad Atlus super boss. He's not even a boss you fight, he's a terms and service list. Unless you're willing to grind for ages, which good luck with that considering the level cap's at 70 for some unknown reason in this game, or you play some bizarre game of RNG manipulation, there are one of two ways this fight goes. You are either going to follow the script of his 50-turn attack pattern, or you die. There is no in between. His elemental damage is so high that it's basically impossible to survive unless you negate the attack completely, because he'll hit you for over 2,000 damage in a game where the health cap is 999. You follow the script or you die, there's no wiggle room here. You better hope he goes down before 50 turns pass, because after that, he'll say screw it, and he's just gonna start spamming his elemental nukes at random. And 50 turns sounds ridiculously long, and there's no way he'd ever get close to taking 50 turns. But keep in mind, the Primeval has 90,000 HP. For reference, the final boss of the game has 18,000. That's 5 times as much health. Or to put it another way, the Primeval has more health than every boss in the main story combined, and then some. This fight is terrible, and I hate it. It's everything bad about Atlus super bosses rolled into one, with the only saving grace being the music in the HD Remaster. They gave him his unused boss theme, which is really cool. But if you were playing the DS original, you just got the regular boss track, which I honestly am not the biggest fan of. I despise this boss fight, and the fact they managed to turn this battle around in the remake is beyond impressive, but we're not talking about Millennium Girl, we're talking about the original Etrian Odyssey, and your reward for slogging through the Claret Hollows, one of the most sadistic and least enjoyable dungeons I've ever played in any video game, is a big fat middle finger telling you to go screw yourself, because you don't even get a cutscene after this fight's over. It's just like, hey, cool, you did it. Okay, now do it again. Number 12, the Elemental Dragons. The other post-game super bosses of sorts, and honestly, in the other games they're meant to raise your level cap. Here, they don't really do much. You kill one of them to access the super boss, you kill one for a warp point and one for a healing spring. This is only ever useful on the final floor, so it's like, why? I honestly don't have much to say about these fights. It's just follow the script nonsense, same as Primeval, but this time the script isn't the size of Rhode Island. You just need to survive their elemental breath, nullify their ailment of choice, and hopefully have enough defense to take a hit or two. and then just get to work cutting down their ridiculously large health bars of about 35,000. Blizzard King and Great Dragon have nothing of value to offer, other than their designs, which I will give a little credit to. They do look awesome. Though I will give some credit to Stormember for having a slightly more adaptive AI and being located in Shinjuku, by far the game's best dungeon, and the one they brought back in Metaphor ReFantasio. But he also falls a bit flat because his AI, while it tries to be adaptive, is ridiculously easy to loop and have him spam Thunder Breath over and over and over again, which would be terrifying if you couldn't easily negate its damage. These fights aren't great, but they do have cool designs and did lay the groundwork for the Draconic Trio to become much better bosses in the future, so at least there's that. Again, I really don't like Etrian Odyssey 1's post-game. You're better off just killing Etrian and stopping right there once it's done. Number 11, Iwar o Penelep. That's a fun name to say. Well, it's time to talk about Big Bird. Iwar o Penelep is a boss that may be somewhat iconic in the modern games, but back before the series went 3D, he was more notorious than anything else. His stats are fine, as the third to last boss in the game, 9,000 HP, is a fair bit, but it's on par with most of the optional bosses you could encounter up to this point in the game, and he's, well, his own respectable boss relying on lightning attacks and beak strikes to deal major damage. But there's this one little Koopa-sized issue in the room, and that's the Forest Folk, aka all the mini-bosses on the floor. You see, if they survive and you kill the boss, they will revive him to full health. Oh, but I'm sure it's not so bad, you just gotta take him out before he revives, right? Well, problem is, he revives instantly. And he also is able to patrol the floor, so you can just kind of get stuck running into him and then get pincered, and you're out of luck at that point. You're just going to have to fight him until he dies and respawns in the middle. You have to kill all 14 FOEs on this floor before you even think about going to fight the bird in charge. But, you know, okay, not so bad. When FOEs die, they stay dead for a week, right? Well, no, this is the one exception to that rule, because if you leave the labyrinth and rest at the inn, all the FOEs will respawn, meaning you have to pretty much do it all in one sitting, killing the enemies, bailing out to the healing fountain on floor 17, and chipping away at it for hours. Thankfully, this is also the one time in the game that pole stones are useful, as you can warp back to floor 16 and save your game, despite being inside the labyrinth, and the remaster has quick saves, but you know what, I'm not cutting it slack for having workarounds. I hate this fight on principle alone. Fuck this version of Koopa. Let the ethnic cleansing of the Forest Folk commence. They're not characters, they're just asshats, and everything about this battle and everything around it is dreadful. Number 10, Fenrir. The early game builds Fenrir up as some slightly dangerous monster leading the wolves, and before you can even get to him, you have to take out some of his minions to reach him properly. Though, funny enough, with some finagling, you can actually skip this boss entirely. But anyways, we're not going to talk about weird glitches or exploits you can do. Once you kill the wolves, you get to Fenrir, and why is he a saber-toothed tiger? Yeah, this made no sense to me. This doesn't even feel like a parody. This feels like someone fucked up and accidentally deleted the boss sprite a week before the game was going to be shipped. So they just recolored the saber-toothed tiger enemy from later in the game to be white with red eyes and said, that'll do. I mean, it's not like Atlus hasn't done lazy asset reuse in the past. Plus, this doesn't carry over into the remake or any other appearances in the series of the big Wolfpack leader, because he's a wolf in all the other games. As for the fight itself, it's pretty unremarkable here. You'd hope the first boss would be some big grand fight to cap off the first stratum, but it's kind of a nothing fight where you just wreck his ass like everything in this game. And he's also comedically weak to fire. But that's not exactly a special trait in Etrian Odyssey 1, as you will see. Number 9, the Golem. Your first optional boss that most players will come across, and yeah, it sure does exist. Okay, that's a bit mean. The boss does look really cool, and most of his attacks utilize his arms for this fight, which emphasizes the importance of binds to make up for his higher stats compared to when you unlock him. However, the original Golem has one massive fault, and by original I mean the Etrian Odyssey 1 variant, because he's actually a pretty fun boss fight 2 onwards. You see, Golem has this gimmick of, when killed, he'll revive himself to half HP the first time. But in the original Etrian Odyssey, he didn't have this mechanic. Instead, he'd buff himself and regenerate 10% of his health every turn, but when he died, with the regen buff active, he'd respawn with about 10 to 20% of his health. And then, do you see the problem here? He'll just keep recasting the buff to stall the fight out, if you're unlucky, and it drags down an otherwise pretty good boss. I promise I do like this game, and I love the series as a whole, but there's a lot of baffling design choices in the first entry that I kinda need to get out of my system, but thankfully, from this point on, we're gonna be in the decent tier. Number 8, the Ant Queen. The Ant Queen is a boss that I should hate on principle, but honestly her fight is actually fine overall, at least in this game. See, she has double the HP of the previous boss, which was only 2 floors ago, or maybe about 2 to 3 hours of gameplay, depending on how much you really decided to explore. It could have been as little as 20 minutes. And she also has infinitely respawning ants to make her more threatening. So, this fight must absolutely suck, right? Well, not quite. You see, by this point, you've not only unlocked the next much stronger stage of gear, but you've probably started to max out at least 1 or 2 of your offensive skills, as you should be around the mid-30s by the time you reach this fight. And if you've explored properly, you should have unlocked the new Ronin class, which is specially designed to take her apart. On top of that, the Ant Queen is actually fairly passive on her own, and focuses more on coordinating with her minion ants when they join the battle. So it's actually a pretty easy first phase until the forces start flooding in. The ants are also nowhere near as deadly as you may think from the area exploration, because, well, they have very little HP and they're almost entirely focused on support. They don't actually make the fight too bad, just a little bit more dangerous. In fact, I think I should mention this again, it's Etrian Odyssey 1, so everything is weak to fire even if it says it isn't. Unless the boss is named the Great Dragon who outright negates fire, it's weak to fire. And this is the first boss to properly utilize all her limbs in battle, which is a mechanic in the Etrian Odyssey series, where you have a head, arms, and legs that are used to perform different moves. This applies to both you and boss fights, with very few exceptions to this rule, where it doesn't require use of anything. In this case, if you bind her arms, you stop most of her defensive skills and her melee attacks. If you bind her legs, well, you don't really do too much, but it does slow her down, and it does lower her evasion. If you bind her head, however, you've pretty much shut off her strongest attack and almost all of her other skills. Overall, I think it acts as a decent boss to mark roughly the halfway point of the story, and the fact that she isn't a Stratum boss does help her out a little bit in my eyes, because if she was like the main Stratum boss, I probably would have been a bit disappointed, but as just kind of a boss that's set halfway through this area, I think she does fine. Plus, this is one of the 2 dungeons in the game I actually really like. Number 7, the Wyvern. The first super boss, I say in air quotes, you encounter in this game is the Wyvern, and it seems like a nigh unstoppable foe when you try to take him on at first, sporting an insane 8,000 HP for only the second stratum, devastating Thunder Breath to fry your party, and resistances to literally everything. Until you come back in mid to late game and realize he's kind of a punk bitch. See, the Wyvern is not that hard, but he does his job pretty well as a big sign saying, don't fight this guy yet. Some of the Etrian Odyssey games have this sort of tradition, where there is a foe that is much too strong for you in the second area. In Etrian Odyssey 1, it's the Wyvern. In Etrian Odyssey 2, it's Salamox, the Bastard. In Etrian Odyssey 5, you have the Primordiphant, and while Etrian Odyssey 4 didn't have one in its dungeon per se, it does have Iwaro Penelope chilling out in a minor dungeon, as well as the Storm Emperor flying around the region if you spend too long there. And Etrian Odyssey 3 on the other hand, has a bunch of crazy sea monsters, which some of them are scaled for in-game. There's honestly not much to this boss. His items are whatever, there's no cutscene for beating him. He's just kind of a tough foe where you want to fight him later on than you initially see him. But his design is cool, and the legacy he provides would have a lasting effect through the series and would go on to become a major story boss in Etrian Odyssey Nexus, and one I quite like. Number 6. Korotrongle. Not gonna lie, the boss names in this game are pretty fun to say. The actual boss of the third stratum is this really cool looking giant flying manta ray dude. On top of that, he's one of the 2 bosses that are summoned by Kupala to act as a major boss, so he has a bit more story relevance going on, but unlike Big Bird, there's no FOEs to worry about. In fact, if you're only focusing on the main story, floor 15 is actually the tiniest floor in the game by a lot. Now, it's debatable if the Ant Queen was halfway through the game or not, but with a mighty 7000 HP, Korotrongle is definitely here to tell the player they're in the big leagues. While he may have a weakness to fire, that's not exactly a thing to be ashamed of considering almost everything in Etrian Odyssey 1 does, and he has the ability to bind party members' arms and head, cutting off most offensive skills, including pretty much any and all fire attacks. And going even further, he has a defensive move known as Aqua Veil to nullify a fire attack. So yes, we have a boss that's actually smart enough to cover his weakness for once, praise God. Otherwise, the sea horror focuses mostly on being surprisingly slippery, but most of his attacks involve the use of his legs, and he's actually quite weak to leg binds. So here's where you'll learn, if you hadn't already known, that binding an enemy's legs sends their evasion stat to a big fat 0, allowing you to clock in some major damage and go for riskier plays if you wish. I can say, with Korotrongle, we are starting to get close to the good boss territory, but unfortunately he just misses that mark for me, because he's a bit too far in the game for such a big weakness to leg binds, and his low defense stat makes it where you'll cut him down to size really quickly once you know what you're doing, and honestly, even if you don't know what you're doing, he's still not actually that hard. He's probably the easiest of the stratum bosses, if I'm being completely real here. Number 5, the Manticore. This guy is probably the most hidden boss in the game. Manticore doesn't have a single side quest or anything really pointing to you to go fight him. In fact, the only way you're going to even know he's there is to thoroughly investigate the 4th stratum and find signs of a savage monster causing a lot of damage to the area before accessing his den, and you're treated to one of the game's 2 super bosses that I actually like. At 8500 HP, his attack is barely higher than Iwaro Penelope, and he actually has lower health than him. He seems pretty unimpressive for a super boss, but you're quickly going to learn he's earned the honors quite well, as this is a boss that loves his bonus effects, having access to every single status effect in the game, and having especially deadly venom that can kill an alien party member instantly, so you need to be on your toes. But this fight actually works fine in a game like Etrian Odyssey because I find status effects bosses generally a bit more enjoyable here than in other games, and especially compared to insane damage foes, simply because you can afflict these bosses with bad statuses right back, and Manticore is no exception, as his only immunity is against instant death and petrification. On top of that, you can only be afflicted with a single status at a time in this game, so you're going to want to weigh your options here about what you think is the best choice. Overall, I think he does exactly what he needs to, and I'm glad this boss comes back in Etrian Odyssey 3, as he's a pretty good one in my eyes. Number 4, Cernunnos. The award for the best regular stratum boss in the game goes to Cernunnos, the King of the Jungle. This is your second major boss of the game, and it's actually built up quite well throughout the second stratum as this mighty foe that none have bested for years, blocking off Etria from the lower stratums, also bottlenecking the nation's economy. And as soon as you enter the room, it's on site. There's no build-up or tension music, you get straight into throwing down with him, with the boss theme kicking in the second you see the dark orb signifying his boss placement. This boss fight begins, and instead of an underwhelming reskin, you get this awesome looking abomination that's absolutely posed right the fuck up, ready to fight you with his 2750 HP and a very nice 69 defense. But that's still not the end, because he's also going to go ahead and summon 2 Cure Rollers to help him in this fight. And here's where the wrinkle is. If you want, you can kill both Cure Rollers right away, stopping the boss from receiving any buffs going forward or recovering any HP. But at that point, he'll not only lay the smackdown on your party, but he'll also start making use of a hidden move known as Glare, which instantly kills the target with very high accuracy. And at this point in the game, you don't have any instant death resistance, so that's a very dangerous move to handle. He's a no-nonsense boss with 2 ways to go about him, either playing the longer and slightly safer method or trying the full boss method. And he has a really cool design. I think Atlus knew they had something cool here, because while he isn't a super recurring boss in the series, the remake put him as the main monster your team fights in the anime opening, and Nexus, well, let's just say the game knows exactly how to play with your expectations. Number 3, Rin and Tlochka. We're back in Shinjuku, and honestly I kinda wish Metaphor would have gone whole hog when adapting this level and putting a boss fight on this bridge, but whatever. Anyways, your big, tragic rival fight of the game is pretty good. It's getting carried hard by the story through here, because these are characters you've known and interacted with throughout the campaign, with Tlochka especially helping you on multiple occasions. But unfortunately, if you want to know the truth of the labyrinth, you're going to have to go through them. And I gotta be honest, while the fight is mechanically fine, it's a case of I know there's a much better version of this boss fight in the remake, and it's not even close. Still, facing off with 2 opponents, each with their own unique combat styles that you can more or less use yourself if you have their job classes, as well as the boss music, do a really good job at setting up the heavy feeling this fight has. Overall, it's a very impactful story moment with some excellent music, and a reasonably fun fight. That's brought down a bit by the surprising lack of difficulty this fight has despite being the penultimate boss of the game, and with Rin and Tlochka being built up as these seemingly unconquerable pillars that are so far above you, but they're kinda jokes in this game. Number 2, Etrian. Ha! You thought I was gonna put the final boss at number 1, didn't you? Well, I almost did. But there's one last fight that I think is a little bit better after I thought about it more critically. Now, you'd think for a man that found a way to stop his aging and became one with the labyrinth itself, that Etrian would be a strong magical foe, using various powers beyond your comprehension to show just how deadly he is. But no. Surprisingly, almost every attack he does is completely physical, because who needs magic when you can just throw hands with your enemies? At 18,000 HP, this is the toughest foe you'll face in the main story, and despite him being a giant tree, he's actually not weak to fire. Not to mention, he regenerates 5% of his health every turn, and can block your attacks with branches if you get too attack happy. His physical attacks are used entirely through his arms, while his special actions are performed entirely through his head, and his legs don't do anything because, I mean, he's a tree, what are you expecting? And you may think a bind or 2 shuts him down, but you'd be wrong, as this boss has the ability to cure bad afflictions, such as binds, and he has the ability to remove your buffs should you stack too many. It's a challenging fight to be sure, but you should be more than willing to go all out. It's the final battle, after all. And speaking of final battle, he has his own boss theme, and in my opinion, it's pretty good. Overall, I think Etrian works as a more than respectable final battle to cap off the journey, and with this location returning in Metaphor ReFantasio, I guess you could say this dungeon also became somewhat iconic. The ending is kind of whatever, but I mean, it's Etrian Odyssey. The endings have never really been that special outside of Millennium Girl and the true ending of Etrian Odyssey Nexus. Etrian Odyssey is a series that's more about the journey than the destination. And speaking of destination, at number 1, what I consider the best boss in Etrian Odyssey, at least the original, Araune. By far the best super boss in this game, and it's not even close. The humanoid plant Araune has an excellent design, being a combination of all these poisonous flowers like the Rafflesia, and with stats that are pretty much on par with Etrian, having the exact same attack and defense, but 2,000 less HP. That doesn't mean she's easier though. She's outright immune to ice magic and lightning attacks, and she has the ability to drain your health. She can also spread pollen, thrash out with her vines, utilizing all her different limbs very well. And all the elements are at her disposal, including fire, despite her being weak to fire. But to be fair, it's Etrian Odyssey 1, everything's weak to fire. She's one of the toughest fights in the game, but she feels completely fair, and she's scaled for you to take on at the end of the main story. With a max level party, yeah, you can approach her however you like. Unlike the other super bosses, there's no script to follow here either, so you're free to experiment and throw things at the wall to see what sticks and what you enjoy the most. And I personally think that works out very well, not to mention, the Plant Lady has become a major boss in this series as a whole, returning as a super boss in Etrian Odyssey 3, the remakes of 1 and 2, and having a relative appear in Etrian Odyssey 5, then acting as a hidden boss in Etrian Odyssey Nexus. Overall, I think this fight is a good deal of fun and a great test of skills for an in-game player that doesn't feel like dealing with all the bullshit that's in Claret Hollows. And while simple, as it is an Etrian Odyssey 1 fight, I think it laid the groundwork well for a lot of the great bosses we'd get in the future of this series, and maybe even other Atlus games as well. And that's all for this video. Etrian Odyssey 1 is a game that hasn't exactly aged the best, to put it nicely, and is by far the weakest entry in the series, but it's still a game I enjoy. Could I recommend playing it, however? Well, first off, it's a dungeon crawler, so keep that in mind before jumping in, but as for how I feel about the game as a whole, don't even bother with the original DS version of the game, it's not worth it. If you must play the original Etrian Odyssey 1, get the HD Remaster, which is available on Switch and PC, as it has a good bunch of good quality of life improvements, some major bug fixes, making the game much more enjoyable. You get Joker and Ringo as party members, as well as restoring some unused music in the game. Though, personally, if you can, I would highly recommend playing the remake on 3DS, Etrian Odyssey Untold: The Millennium Girl. It's a much better product overall, with a much more fleshed out story, characters, dungeons, bosses, and they made the primeval actually fun, which how do you accomplish that? It's a game that I appreciate more than I enjoy, but it did give us a bunch of excellent sequels, and was very clearly influential in some way to the people at Atlus, because this game is given, by far, the most love out of any of the Atlus games in Metaphor ReFantazio, and it's not even close. Either way, that's all I've got for now. If you'd like to see more videos of varying quality, consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you all next time. Take care.
Good atmosphere.